Unbelievably, I fell in love with a woman who was more than 20 years younger than me. My name is Jack, and I am 62 years old, which I never believed was feasible. She even stated that she didn't give a damn about my age. I'll share with you the tale of my ageless love. My wife Helen passed away 10 years ago. It seems like yesterday at moments and another lifetime at others. Since then, I've been by myself, and sometimes I don't utter more than 10 words to anyone to vent. Truth that, I believe I've come to terms with the fact that sometimes silence is preferable to companionship. Otherwise, occasionally my son David, who lives around 30 minutes away with his husband Sarah and their 2 kids, are so cute that every grandchild makes Grandpa feel that Liam, the older one, is 6 years old, intelligent and full of questions that make me chuckle. Emma's laughter reverberates throughout previously silent rooms, circulating the home like a refreshing summer breeze. Rachel, my daughter, has been in Colorado for too long and has always been the one to fly away, explore, and choose a different route. I'm happy for her, but I'm also sorry that She is like her mother, not just in her face, even if I only see her a few times a year. Rachel lost her mother when she was in her early 30s, but she handled it quietly and fiercely, never voiced any complaints, but I know that she secretly harbors the same pain that I do, like I do with my wedding picture in my. Eventually, I believed I had reached the full circle of love lost growing up and every major life chapter. What's left? I only desired tranquility until one day, in the chilly white light between the coffee and the paper towels, I ran into another cart, and everything started in that split second. To clarify, I wasn't searching for kitchen paper because I urgently needed it. However, it was humorous since I needed a reason not to return home too soon. I often glance at the products while meandering through the shop, as if I was strolling in the park. When I entered the coffee shop, I examined the small print and pushed the cart slowly, as if I had important things to do. My thoughts were racing on whether to acquire the filter or the filter bag, so I wasn't paying attention when the cart's wheels struck someone else's cart, although it was only a slight impact that caused me to jump and retreat. I apologize. Wasn't listening, so I grabbed her cart as though it would take away the effect, and she brightened her eyes and she smiled even more and murmured, "It's okay," in a voice as quiet as the sound of, I often hear this on an old-fashioned morning, radio. I assumed she was in her 40s, but her hair was pulled back. I wouldn't lie and say I didn't notice the cosmetics or wedding band right away. "But I'm Jack," I said automatically. I appear to be a reckless driver since she laughed honestly. Rudely or uncomfortably, I couldn't recall the last time someone had laughed at one of my jokes. "Don't worry, we briefly stood there between the coffee and the 3-pack offers, and I wasn't the worst person I've encountered today. I don't know why, but it wasn't love, and I didn't want to leave, nor did I want her to. It seemed like a really nice moment at first. "May I buy you a coffee?" I apologized abruptly, and she cocked her head, seemingly attempting to determine if I was kidding or not, before she grinned and asked, "Why not?" We proceeded to the small coffee station at the supermarket's entrance, where she placed an order. The name was so long that I couldn't remember it, so after she was done, I requested black coffee without sugar. We sat by the glass door, old-fashioned and comfortable, no milk like me, observing passers-by with hot coffee in hand and the discussion, flowing naturally as she claimed to have worked in finance when we first met, and I replied that I was retired from the machine shop where she was. Unmarried and childless, I nodded and informed her about Helen and the cabin. She listened intently and didn't interrupt the kids or grandkids. We spoke for more than half an hour, something that very few people in this hectic society do. An hour with only 2 strangers. Nothing dramatic, no movies and no calming music. Sipping coffee while gazing through the glass in the late afternoon sunlight and briefly sensing that there was, she said, "It was nice meeting you, Jack," as she glanced at her watch and said, "I have to go." Stepped up to her and said, "Hello, nice." I didn't promise anything or give her a phone number. As she left, I heard the shop door open, but days later I couldn't stop thinking about her because of her voice and grin. Her name was Marissa, and in a world where I believed I had explored every nook and cranny, That name abruptly morphed into a new one that I began. Initially, I promised myself that I would buy eggs, toilet paper, and coffee when I went to the grocery store more frequently. But to be honest, I only needed an excuse to go for a walk. I didn't really need those goods. Look around the produce aisle after the coffee shop, and while I won't tell anyone, I hoped that another cart would collide with mine once more. But for 2 weeks, Marissa was not there. After 3.5 years, I started to believe that I would never see her again. When you first notice how fragrant it was, you think it's just a passing phenomenon like smoke dissipating into the air. Regarding asking the coffee shop receptionist if she visits frequently, I didn't because I'm elderly yet still have respect. Then one Thursday afternoon, while pushing a cart in the freezer area, I considered a simple way to... I was preparing dinner when I heard a hello voice behind me. I turned to see that Marissa, was standing there with a little basket that contained 2 almonds, the same hair tie, eyes and smile that made you feel good, along with milk and a pre-made salad. You've been following me, and I smiled when I realized you had just emerged from winter. I was so shocked that I nearly joked. I come here every week, Jack. Perhaps you've been following me. We chuckled along, but she raised her eyebrows, because the joke was excellent, but also because it was so nice to see each other again, not as casually as the first time. And cautious, but it seemed like something had been verified, so I said, "She's real." She gave a small nod, saying, "I'm looking forward to it. I promised to buy you coffee last time. I haven't forgotten." We didn't go. She recommended a tiny spot close to the supermarket coffee shop with large windows, quiet jazz, and circular wooden tables that had been meticulously lacquered. I followed her in her car, and once we were inside, she selected a table by she placed her typical hazelnut drink order at the window, and I always got a black. Coffee. We sat like 2 old friends, reminiscing about past experiences without any awkward silences. Eyes turned away, only tales of life shared like stones on a pond informed me that she had over 20 years of experience in the financial industry, beginning at the bottom and working her way up to... She didn't boast to upper management. Instead, she spoke as though she was aware of how much work she had been doing recently. Considering reducing her hours, she replied, "I'm tired, not because of the work, but more because she wasn't sure if she was." I nodded, realizing that I had been there, whether I was living there or simply swimming upstream. I talked about retirement and how I felt while vacillating between tasks, only to find that I hadn't truly lived. After leaving the facility, I was unable to see that it had taken me so long to find a... When we woke up from coffee, I had a new rhythm, albeit a quiet, leisurely one, where I didn't have to be always busy. She grinned as I opened the door for her at dark, when the headlights were beginning to sparkle on the sidewalk. I was an old-fashioned gentleman, so we didn't touch or embrace, just a... That evening, I sat on the porch and said, "Look, drive safely. Jack, and I'll see you soon, Marissa." As the coffee cooled in my hands, I saw that I was grinning the kind of smile that felt alive, something I hadn't had in a long time, and it wasn't about anything significant. After that, we began messaging, but not frequently. Sometimes it's just cold, remember? "I cooked bananas today for your jacket, and this time they didn't burn the messages." Were straightforward, but I read them repeatedly each time I got them. Once more, we met on the weekends and fell in love like high school students. We occasionally strolled around the park, visited the old coffee shop, and once I took her to the lake where we used to sit by ourselves and observe the motionless water while listening to the ducks. Neither of us ever referred to it as a date, stated so. But one day after our stroll, Marissa turned to face me and remarked, I feel calmer after talking to you, Jack." I was at a loss for words, so I just nodded, although deep inside, on the first chilly, windy day of the season, everything seemed warm as when you pull out an old blouse to wear. I hadn't. I told Rachel or David, not out of shame, but simply because I was unsure of what it was. Wanted to avoid making it into something it wasn't ready to be. I will always mourn Helen, but the odd thing is that I don't feel deceived when I think of Marissa. Instead, I feel permitted to grin once again, Helen had stated prior to her passing. "I swear you don't close if I'm gone one day." "Your heart." I chuckled. But you're my wife, Helen. Who could take your place? She simply shook her head softly, saying that nobody could replace someone, but you may have someone go with you. I wasn't sure if Marissa was that person, but I always knew when I saw her. When a name appears on my phone, I feel a little more at ease, the kind of calm that makes you want to cling to the present. During our last coffee date one afternoon, she asked me with a smile, "Why didn't you ask?" Maybe I need more for my number this time, like last time. I grinned and said, "Time to miss you. Sometimes things that happen gradually last longer." We began to have a Saturday routine, not a strict one, but little things that happened organically. Sunday afternoons spent drinking while relaxing by the lake at North Park and taking morning strolls, coffee in that tiny cafe whenever it rained, or just lounging on an old wooden bench in peace without. I began to figure out what she would order. She preferred hazelnut coffee with oat milk, before anyone felt the need to speak. I thought it seemed a little fashionable at first, but after trying it, she made fun of me for consistently having black coffee and never changing, which I found amusing. "Have you ever tried anything else?" she inquired one day. "I'm a creature of habit," I said, "when I don't see a reason to alter it." She gave me a small smile but said nothing else, although I could see she appeared to be weighing whether I was saying it for the coffee or for life, as evidenced by something in her eyes. I inquired, "Have you ever had anyone?" as we sat on the cafe's veranda in the afternoon, each holding a cup. Marissa stared down at her without my conscious thought. I should have held it in, but it was out before I could take it back. "I've been in love," she whispered softly, swirling her small spoon in coffee. "But no family, no children. It wasn't that I didn't want to, but the wrong person, the wrong moment. And after I grew accustomed to being by myself, I agreed. Being by yourself isn't a bad thing," she said. "Yes, but it's not the best thing either." She paused, then turned to face me and said, "You were Helen, your first love." I cocked my head in a smile. "Dating a few people, but Helen was the she nodded when you spoke about her with such sincere tenderness, because she was such a lovely person, and she was the only one I truly loved. Someone I mentioned, and I believe. I'm still getting used to living without her," Maria grinned, not depressed or envious, simply realizing something I never would have imagined. I remarked, "I don't need anyone to replace Helen, but I need someone who can walk." To which she replied, "You don't have to replace anyone." With me now, everything slowed down the day I arrived home, and I strolled through Helen's, and my wedding picture is still on the shelf in the bedroom. She and her plain white dress are wearing my rented tux. She has a shy face, but her eyes are as bright as a youngster who has just discovered what she had been seeking. And instead of feeling bad, I felt thankful that I had loved her in that way in the past. Now, when I'm thankful that my heart can beat again, and I haven't informed the kids about Marissa, not because I'm concealing it, because I haven't worked it out yet, or perhaps I'm scared that if I saying it will cause things to change, such as when you give something a name, it becomes real. Realness can have a price. Rachel called to say she was spending the weekend at home with the kids. I took out the old tablecloth Helen used and did a more thorough cleaning than normal for the first time in almost a year. Could enjoy and purchase some of the comfort foods Rachel described, such as traditional casseroles, cornbread, etc. When I arrived on Saturday afternoon, the front yard was ablaze with laughing, and Ella immediately ran out of the car to give me a hug. Rachel came out wearing a weary but cozy outfit, followed by Grandpa Jack Mason, who was carrying a huge bear larger than his face. She added, "You're still as skinny as ever." And I replied, "Good for your knees." We both chuckled as we ate a warm dinner at the table. Was stocked with familiar foods, and Rachel discussed the children's school and her transition from banking to freelancing. "I pick my own clients now and my own hours," she added, consulting. Her eyes welling with pride, I answered, "Like my mother, knowing what I wanted and not waiting for approval." Rachel gave me for a long moment. Her eyes seemed to be analyzing me, and she replied, "You seem different," in a softer tone. "You're in love with someone." I nearly choked on my drink, but I set it down. Rachel giggled and glanced at her. Perhaps this was the first time I had ever met someone. I spoke gently to her. Marissa was our fortuitous encounter. It's not difficult, but Dad is pleased when Rachel remained quiet when he was with her. But then she gave a small nod, Dad deserves that, don't you? It seems odd to you after Mom. I miss Mom, she stated daily. But I miss you when you seem content as well, and it seems that Marissa gives you new life. I wanted to give you a hug. We put the story on hold for later that evening when Liam burst into the room with a doodle in his hand. I sat by myself on the porch after everyone had gone to sleep, listening to the crickets. After an early rain, I could sense the smell of damp earth, and my breathing became better, although then came David, who had always been quiet and reserved, and wasn't as easy as Rachel. Restrained, he didn't immediately respond when I mentioned Marissa. Instead, he simply nodded as though absorbing the details. He returned to fix the barn door a week later, and we worked quietly. He said, "I have something to ask," without looking as usual until I pulled out the beer and sat down on the wooden bench. I recoiled a little when he continued. Whatever I said, though, and said, "Do you think Mom will be happy?" I wasn't sure how to. Sincerely, I replied, "I don't know if your mother was the love of my life, but she also knew me better than anyone, and she didn't want me to be a shadow of David for the rest of my life." He said something that will always stick in my memory. "I'm not angry, but I need some time. I'm not used to you having chapter 2 any time after my death because of her." Talking with David made me realize that what I most needed, whether or not everyone around me agreed with it, I wanted to come to terms with the fact that I had lived with memories for almost 10 years. I had half a house, half a supper, and half a life, Maria. But I also had regrets. Didn't attempt to fill that vacuum or take Helen's place, but she did brought everything back to life, much like how spring arrives without much fanfare, and the flowers simply begin to bloom once more. Marissa urged me to walk farther than usual one morning, and she picked a little suburban park with a wooden bridge. We strolled leisurely across a crystal-clear creek while enjoying the sound of the water flowing and the rustle of leaves beneath our feet. As we came to a stop on the bridge, she continued, "Have you ever considered that you don't deserve another chance?" I glanced over. "Yes, many times." "Me too," she said. "But after meeting you, I wondered if the proper course of action is to learn to live with both the past and the present, rather than to forget. That's coming." I didn't respond. Instead, I simply held her hand for the first time outside. The following night I laid the table for the first time since Helen's passing when I invited her to supper at my house. We sat across from each other with 2 sets of dishes, and I chose her favorite wine and lighted candles, not for romance but out of gratitude. I put on some old jazz after someone ate my handmade stew, which was a bit too salty, without complaining. Marissa looked up at me and remarked, "That was my mother's favorite," but I hadn't heard it in 10 years. I got up and held out my hand, asking if you would dance with me. She chuckled, saying, I'm a poor dancer, I know that." And steadily, we moved very slowly and intimately. And as I walked her home that evening, I realized I wasn't just falling in love again, I was living again. I thought the best part of my life was over, but then I met you, Marissa stated before exiting the vehicle, in the coffee shop. As she entered the house with a person I had grown to know, I couldn't help but smile. Every morning when I got home, I rested on the bed for a while the shadow of the tree was on the porch. The bedroom still had. I took Helen's photo, cleaned the dust off the edges, and placed it in place without moving it or intending to. It was in a more noticeable location because I was prepared to love again without feeling guilty, not because I loved her any less. Perhaps I wasn't myself after she went, and perhaps Helen was correct. But now I was returning to the new, more mature version of myself with Marissa, not the old one. Wounded and more grateful that it began as innocently as most significant. Things do. I went to Marissa's house on Saturday afternoon. She wanted to make Italian food this time and invited me to dinner. Not boxed spaghetti, but rather the type with fresh basil even though I didn't know much, I brought a bottle of wine because the sauce had been cooking for more than 3 hours. Talking wine as she worked in the kitchen, I strolled about her comfortable home for the first time and took a close look at the location's bookshelves were modest, unassuming, and neat. Several black and white books were hanging on the wall close to the corridor, which was stocked with financial and historical works. Images of Labrador landscapes and a smaller one framed in dark wood that I walked. I didn't have to question my heart because, up close, I saw a young man with a weary smile and a 1-year-old infant in his arms. Knew the story previously, but I gently called out to Maria, who came out of the kitchen and wiped her hands on a cloth, pointed to the picture, and she took a close look at it. His name was Luke. Lily was the girl who spoke gently, and her voice was as gentle as the first. Rain. Of the season we were engaged, everything was nearly prepared, and suddenly something went wrong. The girl was sleeping in the rear when the car overturned during the storm he was driving. I couldn't say anything, and didn't tell anyone much because neither of them lived. Because if I did, people would see me as having lost everything, and I didn't want sympathy. I wanted to continue living. Not losing them was the most agonizing thing. Rather, it was gradually forgetting the sound of my daughter's voice. She didn't weep or grumble, as though she had recited the tale 100 times in her mind, and at last someone was prepared to listen. I stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. I apologize for asking. However, she put her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm here now that night as I apologize for not being there when you needed someone." As I drove home, I let the wind through the partially open window instead of turning on the music as I usually do. Her words continued to reverberate, and I came to understand that I loved her not because she was, despite her strength and beauty, she was genuine in a manner that few people dare to be after 2 weeks of being harmed. Later, as I was in the backyard changing a light bulb, I felt a dull pain in my lower back. At first I assumed it was a strained muscle, but it persisted. The following week, I discovered blood in my urine, which left me stunned because I had seen Helen. I was all too familiar with the warning flags from each test, diagnosis, and therapy. I went to the doctor and told no one, not even Marissa or the children, that I was having an examination. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling were brighter than normal, as if to conceal the blackness, and the room seemed oddly quiet. The doctor said to me, "But without skirting the issue, you will perform a biopsy since the prostate is abnormally big, but the pictures are concerning." Nodding like a machine, I answered, "I know what's worrying after losing my wife to cancer." Kept quiet about Marissa, even though I knew I should have and that she deserved to know, but when you see someone you love progressively, you can see why I was so terrified that I didn't want her to disappear day by day. Must care for another. Guy is a new chapter in a book that had been replete with sorrow, but instead I began to create distance by making excuses like running errands, doing housework, having a bad back, or anything else. Her texts returned so frequently, and the few phone conversations ended sooner than I had intended. Removing a hand from anything is a good way to do the correct thing. When cold water Maria unexpectedly showed up to my house one afternoon, I was in the garage holding 3 days prior. She stood in front of the rotten board that I had feigned to be mending. "You're pushing me away," she said as the wind blew her hair across her shoulders in the center of the paved driveway. "Just sad. I don't know why, but I know something's wrong." I wasn't shocked. Quiet as though it could blot out the x-rays. For the pictures, the somber nods of I glanced at the doctor as she stated simply, "I don't blame you, I just need to know." "Is there anyone else?" Eyes, the same eyes that had confided in me about her darkest past and that had informed me about Luke and Lily, and I couldn't return them, so I stepped back and set the board down. "No one," I said. I wanted to lie because I wasn't feeling well and didn't want to respond straight away. I wanted to say that I had a cold and a hurting joint, but I felt like I might have held it in for too long. Prostate cancer is unknown, but it's likely that her face didn't change right away. Her face started to crack like a lake rippling in a light wind. "And you believe that pushing me away is the wisest course of action? I don't want to be a burden to you, Maria, and I don't want you to undertake." She moved closer without saying anything, "But I don't want to be the second terrible ending in your life." My heart was thumping too rapidly for my age, and she put her palm on my chest, remarked almost in a whisper, "I love you, because you're the first person who's healthy, not because you're made me feel secure for a very long time." I sobbed, not at the mention of love, but at she shivered as I told her the simple truth. I made a decision for her without allowing her to make her own. I apologized for what I said. Her head said, Don't apologize for being ill or for loving. You. She wrapped her arms around me. This hug was different from the first ones that were guarded and courteous. Her embrace was solid and tight, as though she were clinging to something priceless that the wind could sweep away at any moment. A month after I started treatment, it wasn't always simple. There were times when Maria brought me oatmeal, read me books, played some gentle jazz, and sat by my bed as I lay flat, unwilling to swallow. She was by my side while I was sleeping, making no noise or offering me unwarranted support. That was sufficient. One evening I opened my eyes to see her, dozing off in her chair. With her book still in her hand and her head cocked to one side, I reasoned that if this is late love, it's more I'm not sure what will happen. No one does. But I know that it's better than any love I've ever seen in a movie. I won't pass up the opportunity to live life to the fullest tomorrow, since I recall that year's spring arriving early because of the maple. In late March, the trees in the front yard had started to produce new leaves. Although it was still cold, the sunlight had softened and less severe than it had been during the bitter winter, and I was beginning to get up more frequently and stop lying down. Holding the railing, I gently circled the yard like a log, seeing the grass growing between the bricks. I realized that even though Marissa never followed me like a nurse, she kept a safe enough distance to let me feel free. She inquired one morning that you were the only person there, and she would be there in less than a second if I passed out. I've never let someone take care of me without feeling like I was losing something, so I paused and rested my hand on the fence and let out a breath. I was terrified, and I admitted that I was worried that I would put you in the same painful cycle again. Not the circle of life, she remarked, and when I felt well enough to sit for extended periods of time, I invited Rachel and the children. For the first time in more than a year, I prepared traditional spaghetti using Helen's recipe, and Maria prepared salad, and the smells of butter and cheese, the sound of boiling water, and garlic bread filled the kitchen. Rachel entered the kitchen with a glass of wine in hand and sniffed the aroma of the children's laughter coming from the living room. As a child, she recalled that every Sunday night, her mother would prepare dinner like this. Jack grinned and replied, "I just try not to destroy the formula." After a little period of silence, Rachel moved forward and touched Marissa's. Marissa chuckled and said, "Your mom wouldn't make a salad that good." I was relieved to see the situation as something magically bringing together two ladies from two distinct pasts in a moment where neither had to vanish in order for the other to exist. After everyone had gone home that night, Marissa cleaned the table and I scrubbed the dishes. She then opened the window to, "Have you ever thought about living together?" I inquired, letting the food odor out before leaning against the sink. Looked up, and although the question was gentle, it came to me as a silent admission. She gave me a serene look, her eyes as still as a lake after a rainstorm. "I have," I responded, "but I'm not sure you're ready to stay." "I'm already staying." "Jack." There was no formality or ceremony when Marissa first began delivering items to my home. Announcement. She simply arrived carrying a tiny bag of clothes hanging in a trash bag, a crate of books, and an antique alarm clock and potted plants were the only things she changed. Blended in, Helen's framed pictures remained on the shelves, untouchable by Maria. However, she fitted a new one and cleaned the glass one afternoon, and I gave her half the lake where we had originally walked, which was not replaced but rather added. She named it the closet half, the sink, and the little shelf to the left of the kitchen. My corner, and chuckled, despite the fact that I'm gradually taking over the entire house. One evening, I wanted David and his family to perceive Marissa as the family's lover, not as his lover, so I invited them over for supper. A woman who had accompanied her father through years of quiet, loneliness and illness, David and his wife and 2 kids arrived later than anticipated when Sarah grinned and held out her hand as Marissa opened the door, saying, "It's good to meet you." "You," Marissa said with the same tact she always used toward Liam. "Are you the one who made the banana bread that made the whole room laugh?" was asked right away, but David didn't respond. During the majority of supper, I noticed his eyes, watching him weigh and measure all the while. After dinner, as I was cleaning the dishes, I was deciding if this woman was deserving of what was left of his father's life. Dishes, David entered the kitchen, stood next to me, and remained silent for a while before saying softly and genuine, "Dad, I didn't think I'd say this so soon, but I understand." I didn't look around. Around, I was terrified that I might shatter if I gazed into his eyes at that very moment. I used to believe that Dad was, I see now that he may have been living his life in accordance with his mother's wishes. I nodded, and David placed his hand under the faucet. "Thank you." My shoulder. It was a modest gesture, but it was the long-awaited bridge. That night, after all these years, Marissa and I sat under blankets on the porch. While sipping ginger tea, the moon rose slowly through the spring clouds. "Neither, are they okay, better than you expected?" she said after we had been talking for a time. I replied, "Maybe in the end all." "And are you happy, Jack?" she asked, resting her head on my shoulder. "All they need is to see you happy." I pondered for a while before responding carefully and deliberately. I didn't anticipate finding this again, not with Helen at this age, but with you in this home and in my life. I feel as though I've been. After Marissa moved in, I was given a second spring, and I stopped counting down the days. I used to live as though time were I lived as if time were governed by alarm clocks, shifts and paydays. We're an enemy every season, making it harder for me to breathe and causing me to bend my back a bit more. But today, I live as though time. We're an old acquaintance, calm, occasionally perplexing, but no longer frightening. Maria, I wasn't sure. I liked it at first, but she still makes her coffee the way she wants it, with 2 scoops of hazelnut for her and 1 strong for me. However, I can't begin my morning without it now. Perhaps it tastes or serves as a reminder that another person woke up with me, and her mark started to appear in the house, but not intrusively. She adds a few books on the shelf and hangs some landscape pictures in the hallway. She found a reading lamp at a flea market in the living room, and there was a little pot of basil in the kitchen, market where she now reads every night while sitting in a chair with her legs crossed. Helen was still visible in the wedding picture on the shelf in the tablecloth she had sewed in Rachel's eyes, with spectacles resting on the bridge of her nose. Helen was no longer a bother when she spoke about her mother, but rather a dusty recollection on a shelf. In order to be remembered appropriately and not to be forgotten, Maria had never. Helen always trod lightly over everything that belonged to her, as if she valued the sacred place in someone else's heart. After she stood for a while in front of Helen's picture and mutely muttered, "I hope you're not upset that I'm here." I gave her a back hug while saying, if Mom was still here, she would. While I was watering the plants on the porch late one day, I received an invitation to apple pie and a question about whether I had made you happy. With a cheeky smile, Marissa emerged with her hands behind her back and said, "I have an idea." I looked at her senior yoga instructor. Again, no. Since it's not too far, I believe we ought to go on a road trip this time. I considered it, but I've never witnessed a sunset on the Oregon coast up north. I brought a neck pillow and a jazz, because it's been a while since I've traveled far and my back doesn't like vehicle seats. Playlist she grinned at, and I chuckled, which may persuade someone who is about 70 years old. We left on a Tuesday. It was a gentle morning, and Maria had a movie, a music box, and a basket of cookies. The vintage type of camera that has no screen and no retouching. Recalled how we traveled the coast, stopping at little towns to have clam chowder, listen to the waves, and explore the second-hand shops, writing a note in the small notepad she was carrying on day 2. Jack. On day 4, the sea was murky, but he laughed as he sneezed 4 times in succession, claimed to be able to see me well, but we didn't talk much because it wasn't required. Silence has a certain tone when 2 individuals truly know one another. On Thursday afternoon, we came to a secluded beach. I brought 2 folding chairs as the sky turned golden, and she brought 2 plastic cups, a tiny bottle of wine, and a wool blanket as we sat with the waves gently crashing at our feet and the sun slowly sinking, perhaps wanting to stay with us. When Maria put her head on my shoulder for a little while longer, I thought my life was ended. I whispered, "Me too," and she retorted, "But it seems we're just changing scenes." I took a tiny item out of my coat pocket and an ancient keychain. With two glass panels had a picture of Marissa on one side and a picture of Helen and me at our wedding on the other. "I'll always carry both," I remarked, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and grinning away from the camera. "One side is she." Didn't respond. Instead, she took my hand and gave it a light squeeze, indicating that the other side is where I am now. When summer arrived a month after the trip, things finally clicked. Wrote a few words in my notebook while sitting on the porch. I didn't keep a diary. Sometimes I write down things that are valuable, like, "I lived a full life. I felt I had vanished after losing someone I had loved for almost 40 years. Yet then, on a completely typical day, I saw someone in the middle of a grocery store aisle who convinced me that the anapology and a cup of coffee can still be the beginning of the second half of life." Marissa turned to face me as we turned off the lights in our bedroom at night. Her voice was dreamy. "What are your plans for tomorrow?" Without hesitation, she said, "Wake up with me and figure it out." She laughed the most. Plan I've ever had, so there were only two of us. No fireworks, no background music, and no vows. People in a tiny house, the sound of coffee spilling, and love that is sacred even without a romantic history. I have loved two women in my life, not to avoid the past, but to fill the void. One taught me the meaning of first love, while the other subsequently showed me that no one can ever fully replace the ability of my heart to open. Others, they simply assist me in living both parts of my life, and if there's one task I appreciate you listening, and I'm positive that I still adore. This life. I'll see you in the next Story Team's Daily Surprise Stories. Thank you until the finish.